Since the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, the situation has gone from bad to worse. Today, 20 million Afghans are starving and millions are internally displaced. The Taliban is back in power. They are once again providing sanctuary to terrorist groups. They have decreed that Afghan girls shall not have access to education above the 6th grade. In a recent report to Congress, John Sopko, the U.S. Special Inspector General of Afghanistan, wrote, "Unless the U.S. government understands and accounts for what went wrong, why it went wrong, and how it went wrong, it will likely repeat the same mistakes in the next conflict." I'm Michael Scharf, Dean of Case Western Reserve University School of Law. In this broadcast of Talking Foreign Policy, our expert panelists, including Sopko, will seek to answer those questions right after the news. Welcome to Talking Foreign Policy. I'm your host, Michael Scharf, Dean of Case Western Reserve University School of Law. In this broadcast, our expert panelists will be discussing the Afghanistan debacle. In our first segment, we will discuss the goals, strategies, and tactics of the longest war in U.S. history. In the second segment, we will examine what went right and what went wrong. And in the final segment, we'll discuss the lessons learned and apply them to other current conflicts in which the U.S. is engaged. Headlining our panel of experts is Cleveland native and Case Western Reserve Law alum John Sopko, who was sworn in as Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction on July 2, 2012. He was appointed by President Obama, served under President Trump, and continues to serve under President Biden. For the last 10 years, Sopko and his staff have raised concerns about waste, fraud, and abuse of U.S. assistance funds for Afghanistan, as well as the sustainability and viability of the Afghan government and military ahead of the U.S. withdrawal in 2021. John, thank you for joining us today.
Pleasure to be here.
And we are also joined by Dr. Shannon French, the director of the Inamori International Center for Ethics and Excellence at Case Western Reserve University. She was previously a professor at the U.S. Naval Academy and was recently named the General Hugh Shelton Distinguished Chair in Ethics by the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College Foundation. She is the author of the acclaimed book, The Code of the Warrior, Exploring Warrior Values Past and Present. It is great to have you back on Talking Foreign Policy, Shannon.
Great to be back, Michael.
And we are also happy to welcome back Dr. Paul Williams, the president of the Public International Law and Policy Group, a Nobel Peace Prize nominated NGO. Paul has served as legal advisor in 20 peace negotiations and is the author of the recently published book, Lawyering Peace. Welcome back to Talking Foreign Policy, and this time Paul is actually in our studio in Cleveland.
Thank you, Michael. It's a pleasure to be back.
And finally, we are joined from West Virginia by Dr. Greg Noon. He's the director of Fairmont State University's National Security and Intelligence Program. Greg is a retired captain in the U.S. Navy, and he served as head of the International Law Branch in the Pentagon. Welcome to our show, Greg.
Thank you for having me, Michael.
And let's start things off with Inspector General Sopko. This month, you filed a report to Congress about the current state of affairs in Afghanistan. Can you provide a summary of some of the highlights from your report?
Certainly, Mike. And to say things aren't great in Afghanistan would be an understatement. The situation was grim before the Taliban returned to power and has only gotten worse. So Afghans now face the highest levels of hunger in the world, and 2/3 are dependent on food aid. So life is worse for Afghans right now, and particularly in the midst of this humanitarian crisis, the Taliban have increased oppression of women and girls.
So let's provide some context to this, and I will ask retired Captain Greg Noon to take us back 20 years. Greg, why did the U.S. invade Afghanistan in 2001? Who were we fighting, and who were our allies?
Well, and of course, all of our listeners know that it was a result of 9/11. But even before 9/11, one of our key allies in the region, the Northern Alliance, their leader, Massoud, was assassinated 2 days prior to 9/11. Of course, we were struck on 2 days later. And as a result of our ability to project self-defense through the UN Charter and our NATO agreement, we then went to Afghanistan shortly thereafter and proceeded to prosecute the war, as we say in the military. Now, one of the things that we demanded right away from the Taliban was to turn over Osama bin Laden and the al-Qaeda members, destroy terrorist camps, and return any hostages they may have had. The Taliban started this kind of negotiations where they wanted proof that Osama bin Laden actually was behind 9/11, and then they offered to turn him over to a third party for trial. So as a result, it ended up being a full-scale invasion with the U.S. leading and its NATO allies in support, along with the Northern Alliance.
And then let me bring Paul Williams into this. Paul, what was the end game, the strategic goals? In other words, what was our 20-year engagement in Afghanistan all about?
I think we're still trying to figure that out, Michael. We went in, as Greg noted, in order to hunt down Osama bin Laden, to destroy al-Qaeda. And for the first 2 years, that was our goal. And then for the next 18, we drifted. I'll tell you a quick little story. I was down at the Air War College for a roundtable, have a think about our Afghanistan policy, early years of the Obama administration. And there was a Marine officer who very clearly explained his tactic of he was going to go to the Helmand province, he was going to clear, and he was going to hold. And then I looked at the foreign policy official and I said, great, and why is he clearing and holding? No kidding. The answer was, President Obama is very smart. I'm sure he has a plan.
And Paul, just to follow up, what does clearing and hold mean, actually?
Well, essentially it was, and Greg can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but this is a military tactic to essentially for the armed forces to go into an area, clear it of hostile forces, clear it of Taliban, hold it at great risk for something to then happen, for reconstruction, for democracy building, for, the rule of law. But what was shocking was it wasn't clear why they were clearing and holding. What was our overall strategic objective? And it drifted for 18 more years.
So then after these 18 years, why did the U.S. abruptly pull out of Afghanistan?
Because we lost.
And abruptly, that's the way to go with these things?
Well, we can have a conversation about whether that's the way to go or not. But we would have continued to drag on and on and on. We could have done it better, and we can talk about how we could have negotiated our surrender, how we could have negotiated our loss. Instead, we pretended that it was some sort of victory. We pretended we were holding over to the Afghanistans. In fact, we weren't prepared to do it the proper way.
Okay, so a moment ago, John Sopko, the Inspector General, told us about the current state of affairs in Afghanistan. To summarize from his recent report, the Taliban are back in power. Nearly 20 million people in Afghanistan, almost half the population, are facing acute hunger. There are 3.5 million internally displaced Afghans, while 2.7 million Afghans are refugees outside the country. And meanwhile, the Taliban has ordered that all women must cover their faces in public and should only leave their homes in cases of necessity. They've even decreed that girls shall not have access to education above the 6th grade. Women are prohibited to drive, take public transport, or to hold jobs. So I'm going to turn to Shannon. Shannon, you're a military ethicist. You've worked at the Naval Academy. What must it be like for U.S. and coalition troops who fought in Afghanistan to see the current state of the country post-withdrawal?
Well, Michael, the word is traumatic. That's what it's like. It is very traumatic. For those who fought there and for those who were involved in diplomatic roles and various NGOs and others as well. And this has many layers to it. What we're seeing is a lot of what we call moral injury. And moral injury, in broadest terms, comes from the sense of having betrayed your own values, often against your will and following authority. And it also can come concurrently with feeling that leadership has betrayed you. And if you think of how we look at the way that we withdrew and the people who were left behind, also those who were lost over the 20 years and those who are left questioning, what did they die for? And was anything achieved? All of that leads to an absolute tsunami of moral injury and psychological trauma.
Wow. And, Colin Powell used to talk about the, quote, Pottery Barn rule. I think he said, if you break it, you own it. So, Shannon, as an ethicist, would you say the United States is morally responsible for the dismal state of affairs in Afghanistan?
Yes, we are, but of course there's more to it than that. And the reason there's more to it than that, as my colleagues already noted, it isn't as though Afghanistan was unbroken before 2001. When the Taliban took power in 1996, this was already an awful situation, and you mentioned the plight of women and girls in particular. Under the Taliban, that has been a nightmare. Arguably, one of the painful aspects of this entire experience is that we brought hope. We brought the suggestion of a different future. We brought 20 years of saying, we're going to help you, and even in some cases actually succeeding in helping children and women and girls get different kinds of education and different kinds of experiences. We rebuilt some things and so forth, and then we left. And so in some ways, hope is the cruelest gift of all.
Oh. Well, Greg, besides our moral responsibility, from a national security perspective, why should we as Americans care about the situation in Afghanistan today?
Yeah, Michael, that's a great question. And allow me a moment to follow up on Shannon's point. I was in Afghanistan in early 2003 as the U.S. started talking about invading Iraq. And the Afghans I was working with all said to me, please don't invade Iraq. You'll forget about us. And the only thing I could do was look them in the eye and tell them, you're absolutely right, because the resources are going to go to Iraq and they're not going to stay here. And remember, at that time, we were promising a Marshall Plan for Afghanistan. So that idea of hope. From the national perspective, for national security perspective, the United States values order in the international sphere, as opposed to Putin's Russia that values chaos, and a communist Chinese government that pretends to follow rules but cheats on the rules. So order is in our national interest. That's why Americans should support international law and what happens out there around the world. And so having a country that's unstable, that has internal strife, that could be a place that could harbor terrorists, a place that could cause a flow of refugees. Those are destabilizing events. And eventually that will push into an area that causes problems for the U.S. national security interests.
All right, so Greg has made the case of why we should continue to care about Afghanistan, maybe why we should continue to be involved in Afghanistan. Paul, do you agree with that?
Well, I think we need to learn the lessons of what happened in Afghanistan, because we can care about it. We can feel the sense of moral responsibility, but quite frankly, Michael, there's very little we can do about it. We gave the Afghans $2 million, 20 years of an American security umbrella, and there was no measurable change in the outcome of a democratic, anti-corrupt, rule of law-based society. So, yeah, sure, we can care about it, but we have no ability to impact it anymore. We should, however, learn the lessons when we think about what comes next in Syria, what comes next in Sudan, and what comes next in Ukraine, because we cannot make the same fatal mistakes in those territories and countries that we made in Afghanistan.
Well, that's a great time for us to take a short break. When we return, we'll talk about what went right and what went wrong in Afghanistan. So stay with us. Welcome back to Talking Foreign Policy, brought to you by Case Western Reserve University and IdeaStream Public Media. I'm Michael Scharf, Dean of Case Western Reserve University School of Law. I'm joined today by the U.S. Special Inspector General for Afghanistan, John Sopko, the president of the Public International Law and Policy Group, that's Paul Williams, the director of the Inamori International Center for Ethics, that's Shannon French, and the former head of the Pentagon's International Law Branch, retired Navy Captain Greg Noon. We're talking today about the Afghanistan mess. There's no other way to say it. And in this segment of our show, I'd like to focus the discussion on what went right and what went wrong for the United States and Afghanistan. So let me begin with Inspector General Sopko. You have submitted at least a dozen lessons learned reports to Congress. Can you provide us a summary of the top 3 lessons from your most recent reports?
I'll try to, Mike. It's ironic. A week before the Afghan government collapsed, we issued a report entitled What We Need to Learn, Lessons from 20 Years of Afghan Reconstruction, because that was close to the 20th anniversary. And what we highlighted, major problems or lessons, you could say, were that we had an inability on the U.S. government side to develop a coherent 20-year strategy. We also had an inability to understand and to be honest about how long that mission would take. I think we said we were turning the corner so many times we turned around like a top. Third issue was that we failed to ensure that the things we were spending tens of billions of dollars on, like the Afghan military, would be sustainable when we departed, which they were not. And lastly, we could not and did not account for the impact of the ongoing violence and its impact. And I shouldn't say the last, but the biggest issue, I think, was the fact that we totally ignored the corruption in Afghanistan and how that impacted our ability to convince the average Afghan that we're actually doing something good for them. And that's helped the Taliban to recruit when they saw all of the corruption.
I think it's really helpful the way you package that in a way that was so economical and easy to understand. And it's tempting to just dismiss Afghanistan as a total policy failure. But it's not that simple, I think. So, John, can you tell us about some of the successes in the U.S. involvement in Afghanistan?
Yeah, I mean, there were a number of successes, and I'm glad you're highlighting that. But I think you should have expected some successes because we were throwing so much money at the problem. Remember, we spent more money in Afghanistan on reconstruction than we did on the entire Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe.
And how much would that have been?
$146 billion. I think the Marshall Plan was way less than that in Europe. So obviously some of that stuck. It's like throwing spaghetti on a wall. Some of it stuck. Our help for women and girls was an improvement. That was a success. The civil society development was a success. The development of a free and independent press was a success. We increased the literacy rates. We decreased the child mortality rates. We increased the per capita GDP in Afghanistan. But the problem is basically all of those successes have disappeared.
Yeah. So, Paul, Afghanistan has been called a bipartisan debacle. What do you consider were the major mistakes of each of the administrations, from Bush to Biden?
Well, Michael, I think there were 2 consistent mistakes all the way through. President Bush had it right initially, anti-terrorism, hunting down al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden. But then he drifted into believing his own propaganda. We were democratizing Afghanistan. We were making strides. We were having success with the rule of law. We weren't. It was propaganda. And that got picked up by Obama and then Trump. And then, Biden, I think, saw it for what it was and pulled the plug. The other failure is that I think we wanted it more than the Afghan people. We did what we always do. We found the 5% or 10% of the population that was like-minded with us and our allies, and we created an echo chamber and amplified it. And we weren't in touch with the other 90% of the population, which apparently weren't that committed to these democratic and rule of law successes, or at least our version of how one might have rule of law. And so I'm not surprised that it collapsed. We threw a lot of spaghetti at the wall. I don't think any of it stuck.
And I guess some of the things that we did were really making matters worse. And I have in mind during the Bush administration when we instituted the practice of waterboarding Afghan detainees in order to try to find information to prevent the next 9/11. So let me ask Greg, our military expert, and Shannon, our ethicist, how did that policy of waterboarding affect our mission in Afghanistan? Greg, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. And I look forward to Shannon's answer on this as well, but I think she'll agree with me. Not only is torture immoral, illegal, unethical, it doesn't work. So from a pragmatic standpoint, you're applying pressure to people to try to derive certain information, and you're not going to get that information. What you're going to get back is information that people think you want to hear, so you'll stop putting them in a painful situation. And really what it ends up doing, aside from the horrors of that, it then pushes the fence sitters. Paul just gave percentages of where the Afghan population may or may not have been, but the fact of the matter is there's always a significant number of fence sitters, and they're looking at both sides, and they're trying to figure out which way they should go. So you torture my uncle, and he comes home and tells the family about it. Well, guess which side we're going to pick after that? The side that tortured him, or the side that's saying we need to get rid of these people and get our country back? So it doesn't work, is the bottom line from a pragmatic standpoint. Shannon?
Well, Greg, I agree with you 100%. It is indeed not just illegal, but unethical. And the other point, of course, which you made, is that it's a propaganda boon for our enemies. And not only the enemies that we're fighting in whichever conflict that we do the act, but obviously this spreads around the world and it damages our moral authority. It damages trust, not only again with enemies, but also amongst allies, and just overall erodes our legitimacy.
So, Greg, let me turn and ask you about the role of Pakistan in the Afghan conflict. So, ultimately, was Pakistan an ally or a foe?
Well, we like to say Pakistan's a frenemy. They're both a friend and an enemy. Pakistan supposedly a major non-NATO ally, but the reality of it is that Pakistan created the Taliban. The Pakistani intelligence services are what actually makes the Taliban go. And part of this is the neighborhood they live in. Pakistan wakes up every day thinking they're going to go to war with India. So they want their back door, being Afghanistan, run by people that they trust, that they're funding, that they're on the same page with. So the fact of the matter is they nurtured the Taliban, they've supported them, they've provided them sanctuary, and this really impacted our ability to have any type of effective counterinsurgency when people could bounce back and forth over the border. And at the end of the day, where was Osama bin Laden living for years? He was living just down the street from Pakistan's version of West Point. So there's a reason why we couldn't tell Pakistan when we were conducting the mission to go get bin Laden, because we really cannot trust him in this area.
Shannon, as a military expert about ethics and morality, let me ask you about complaints of U.S. soldiers that they were trained to fight and then ordered to nation build, something that was outside their expertise. Is that a fair criticism?
I'm a bit on the fence on this one because in reality, our troops across the various branches are really quite flexible. There is a fair amount of agility and ability to learn different skills even on the fly. And we've shown that historically. So I'm not overly sympathetic to the argument that they can't switch roles back and forth, because they have, and they do. The bigger problem for me, and I've heard this certainly amongst my friends in the military, is that, as was mentioned earlier, the resources and the focus shifted to Iraq. And when that happened, this sense that you're supposed to be doing nation building, but you're not our priority anymore, and you can't count from one moment to the next on that support coming back at any point, and we know it didn't, that was what caused more frustration.
And then, John, you mentioned how much we spent. You said it was more than the Marshall Plan, and that was the plan that rebuilt Europe after World War II. So we're talking billions and billions of dollars. Your office was created to combat the waste and fraud in the administration of the U.S.-funded programs in Afghanistan. How much waste and fraud did you uncover?
Well, we uncovered quite a bit, Mike, and we did a rather intensive look at every report we issued, every indictment we issued in a time frame of 2008 to, I believe it was 2019. And after this analysis, we determined about 30% of, at that time, in that period, that was only $63 billion. But that's what we determined was subject to waste, fraud, or abuse. And we can extrapolate from there that probably about 30% of the money we spent on reconstruction was wasted.
And I've read in your reports your theory of the absorption principle. Can you tell us about that?
Well, the absorption rate is a term used in development circles, and it talks about how much money you can give to a country to assist it in comparison to the GDP before that money is probably wasted. And depending on the development of the individual country, it goes from anywhere from 15 to 30%. What we discovered when we looked at that and talked to development experts, that most of the time we were in Afghanistan, the United States alone was giving more than 100% of the GDP of Afghanistan. So you can imagine what that basically means is the money probably was wasted. And again, absorption rate, the best way I think, as some scholar described it to me, was picture a sponge in your kitchen sink. You pour water into it and it holds the water, but all of a sudden it hits a certain point where the water just flows out. And that flowing out of the water is basically money that could be wasted in Afghanistan.
So just to give some context to that, how does the 30% rate of fraud and abuse compare with the U.S. involvement in other conflicts where we spent a lot of aid money, like World War II, Korea, Vietnam, or Iraq?
Yeah, I would like to answer that question, but I don't think anybody has ever studied that. I know we were asked to do it for Congress, and it was very labor-intensive. I know Congressmen asked DOD, state, and aid IGs to do it, and as far as I know, they never even did it for Afghanistan. And I don't think anybody has ever done it for World War II, Korea, Iraq, or Vietnam. So we don't have an answer, but I don't think Afghanistan is an outlier. And I think probably you have similar rates in those other countries also.
And then, John, from your perspective as Special Inspector General, how badly would you say that corruption in the Afghan government undermined the U.S. mission in Afghanistan?
Well, Mike, that's a good question, and I alluded to it before. I mean, I think we have a tendency to view corruption as just a criminal justice law enforcement issue. It is not. It is a national security issue. And what we had in Afghanistan was we created so many corrupt players who were more than just corrupt players. They became the government. They became the oligarchs, the warlords who were abusing the system, that the average Afghan basically preferred the Taliban to the corrupt judges, police, and whatever, we sent out there. And so we lost the support, and the Afghan government, central government, lost the support of the Taliban. The corruption and the human rights abuses that these oligarchs and warlords in Afghanistan committed basically were used by the Taliban as a recruiting tool. And it was very successful. So at the end, you didn't have people who wanted to fight for the Afghan government because it was so bad.
Wow, I hear a theme really emerging here. Instead of winning over hearts and minds, we seem to have done everything possible to lose hearts and minds. Paul, let me then switch over to the issue of the peace negotiations. You've been counsel in over 20 peace negotiations. From your perspective, what was wrong with the Doha Agreement and the negotiations? That's the agreement that was signed between the Trump administration and the Taliban in February 2020.
Well, Michael, I think the fundamental flaw of both the negotiations and the agreement were that they were Potemkin. We pretended to have negotiations about a future sustainable Afghanistan where the Taliban would play a role. And we reached an agreement that provided for the Taliban to make a number of commitments that they were never going to abide by. We had an agreement for an intra-Afghan dialogue that the Taliban were never going to consent to, and we didn't actually really care about. We had lost the war. We wanted to get out. But we pretended that there was somehow an equilibrium, if not a success, and that we had built a nation and we were going to make some room for the Taliban to join into that national project while we eased our way out. The Taliban saw right through this. I'm not sure we saw right through it. I'm not sure that the military fully grasped the dire strait of the failed nation that we attempted to build, or of the military circumstances on the ground. And certainly the Trump administration and the State Department didn't grasp that. And so when it came time to implement it, the security infrastructure collapsed, and we saw what happened with the Taliban filling that immediate vacuum.
And then, John, I know that you issued reports before our withdrawal warning about some of the mistakes we could make in pulling out too quickly. What mistakes ultimately were made in the U.S. withdrawal? Was it inevitable that the government would fall and that the Taliban would take over? What could we have done differently? And we only have a minute for you before the next break.
Well, I would quickly say I would say it came almost inevitable. The warning was that the military was basically hollow. The government was not supported by the people, and we go in great depth in some of our reports. But basically, once the troops left, they needed close air support. The Afghan government was the only one that could provide that, and we took the contractors with it, and we predicted, and the Air Force predicted, within a matter of months, the Afghan Air Force would collapse. And once that happened, it was over.
And it wasn't even a matter of months, was it?
Well, our prediction came in January, and so August it was. By the time the contractors left, it was over.
Well, it's time for another short break. When we return, we'll talk about the lessons learned from the Afghanistan experience. We'll be back in a moment. This is Michael Scharf, and we're back with Talking Foreign Policy. I'm joined today by experts in the continuing crisis in Afghanistan. In this final segment, we're going to be discussing the lessons learned and their application to U.S. involvement in other conflicts in the future. Paul Williams, let's begin with you. After nearly 2 decades of fighting and more than $2 trillion in U.S. taxpayer funds, after the death of more than 6,000 Americans and 100,000 Afghans, what did we gain from our war in Afghanistan?
Michael, we gained an understanding that the United States no longer knows how to do nation building and maybe should no longer attempt to do nation building. Now, I know that isn't actually your question, but it's something I wanted to say, so I'm going to use that question for it. We spend trillions of dollars on nation building on a system that simply does not work. We need to get out of that business or develop a new paradigm for what we're going to do in Sudan, Syria, Yemen, Ukraine. We cannot use the Iraq or the Afghanistan model. It does not work.
Well, let me just follow up. We did, and maybe I'll turn to Greg Noon about this. We did kill Osama bin Laden, the leader of al-Qaeda, and I think it seems to me that we knocked al-Qaeda on its butt. Greg, are we stronger today versus al-Qaeda than we were 20 years ago?
So the greatest legal answer ever is it depends, right? So the fact of the matter is Al-Qaeda is dispersed, but you have other groups that are taking its place, either in kind of remnants of Al-Qaeda or new organizations. So there's always going to be organizations out there like that. You mentioned the killing of bin Laden. I want to go back to something that Shannon and I talked about. We found bin Laden through good old interrogation techniques. We did not find him through the use of torture. The fact of the matter is we kept interviewing people and interrogating people, and there was one individual's name that kept coming up, and everybody got really squirrely around when that name came up, and that was the courier. And the courier that was the connection to where bin Laden was in an isolated location without even internet and any phone service. So I do want to tie that in there, that despite some of the things that were done over the course of the war, at the end of the day, it was a good old-fashioned interrogation that we used to be able to catch the guy that we wanted to catch the most.
And I guess what you're saying, Greg, is that we are no better off versus Al-Qaeda than we would have been had we not invaded Afghanistan.
Look, I think there are different ways that we could have undertaken this, and I think Iraq is the real mistake because that took our eye off the ball. If we were honest about this Marshall Plan idea for Afghanistan, I think we could be in a different place. But once you inserted a full-scale invasion for Iraq, for a guy who lives in palaces, guys who live in palaces are always easier to catch than guys who live in caves. And the fact of the matter is we should have engaged in more small-scale operations like we did in the Philippines, down in Jolo, much more effective against terrorist organizations than a full-scale standing army, clear and hold operations type event.
All right, so everybody's heard that we've pulled out. However, the international community is continuing to provide humanitarian aid to people in Afghanistan to meet their shelter, sanitation, their nutritional and medical needs. But I assume we're not giving any more money now that we've pulled out. Is that right, Inspector General Sopko?
You're wrong. We are giving money. We've provided close to $8 billion. $8 billion since the Taliban took over. Now, some of it, about $2 billion, is humanitarian. Some is this $3.5 billion that the Afghan government had at the Federal Reserve, which has now been put into a fund to recapitalize the central bank without giving any assistance to the Taliban, which sounds kind of difficult to do since the Taliban controlled the central bank. And then other money to assist the Afghans who fled. But the important thing is, you talk about the international community. You have to remember we provide most of the funding to the international community, which is kind of ironic. So there is a lot of money being spent by the U.S. government to assist the Afghans, not the Afghan government. You have to be careful about that. We're not supposed to be giving any money to the Taliban, but we assume some of it is probably sneaking through.
But we've heard today that the Taliban has totally failed to live up to any of its promises on human rights and counterterrorism back in those Doha agreements. So in light of that, John, do you think we should just cut off our assistance and completely disengage from Afghanistan altogether?
You know, that's a very good question. And but unfortunately, and I don't mean to dodge it, Mike, but we as IGs don't do policy. We do process. Because if we, promote a policy, we can't then later go in and assess it or audit it or something. So historically, no IG can do policy. We raised that question in our last quarterly report because we are shipping money in there, and we do know that some of it is going to the Taliban, and we do know that the Taliban is utilizing it both domestically and internationally, the humanitarian assistance, to get better approval ratings among their people. I don't know the answer to that, and that's a big question. That's something the President and Congress really need to look at.
So I have to say, John, you're about the most candid official I have ever had on this show or met publicly. Let me turn to Paul because your NGO has the word policy in it. So you're not afraid to talk policy. What would your answer be? Should we cut off the aid?
Michael, we have to be very concerned about continuing the failures of our earlier engagement for the last 2 decades, and we may be doing that by continuing the assistance. Are we funding a Taliban success story? You know, we funded it in an odd way by supporting Kabul over the local governors and local agencies and entities, and that, as Johnson noted, pushed people towards the Taliban. Now, the Taliban basically walked into Kabul. They're doing these outrageous actions vis-a-vis the women and the girls, and no one really seems to care except for the women and the girls. And if we're going to fund $6 billion, if that was what it was, for the Taliban, they're going to be successful. That will undermine our effort to promote democracy and values that we care about in the neighborhood and around the globe.
And I see Shannon. She does care. So I'm going to ask you this question. Shannon, the world has rallied to support the Ukraine people in their struggle against Russia's illegal invasion and occupation. Supporting the Afghans' people's current struggle against the Taliban is obviously more complicated. What kinds of support, Shannon, do you think could make a difference?
Well, the key word that Paul used a minute ago is local. One of the many ways to describe the mistakes that we've made is by focusing on anything central, because anything central is tied up with the Taliban, it is tied up with corruption. The only kind of help that's going to do any good and the only kind of engagement that's going to be ethical at this stage is at the very local level, where we are helping groups that are still trying to build on the small gains that remain.
All right. So, Greg, let me turn to you. Are the women in Afghanistan protesting the draconian restrictions of their rights that have been imposed by the Taliban government? I haven't seen anything on the news, but it could be that the Taliban is just blocking us from seeing it. What's your take on that?
Yeah, no, protests are becoming rarer and rarer since the Taliban returned to power, highlighted by violence, highlighted by torture and abuse when people are in custody, and particularly for women, the social stigma that comes with doing something like that. I'll say this, going back to the last 2 answers. I think if the American people knew that $8 billion was going to the Taliban, I think they'd lose their minds.
Well, Greg, they're hearing it now on Talking Foreign Policy. So
I know.
Cat's out of the bag.
Yeah, and I hope the wider view listening audience hears that, because the fact of the matter is that Shannon's points are excellent ones about working locally, but that's not how the Taliban works. I mean, the Taliban's going to have their fingers in every pot. There's, unfortunately, in an environment like that, there's a lot of grease payments that go around, extending the culture of corruption, which has such a pernicious and negative effect on any development, and we'd be just pouring in good money after bad money after good, or however the phrase goes. And to Paul's point, we're just continuing this failure.
And I suppose what you're saying also is that the situation in Afghanistan is qualitatively different than the situation, for example, in Iran. We're seeing in Iran and Saudi Arabia and in other countries throughout the Middle East this wave of women rising up and standing up against this anti-women type of draconian measures that these countries have. So let me turn to Shannon. Do you think that we're seeing something larger here that might actually bleed over to Afghanistan? Are we on the cusp of a global rejection of extreme interpretations of Islam that deny women autonomy? Could this be sort of like the Arab Spring?
Well, I mean, I brought up hope in a negative way previously. Here, I'm going to have a bit of hope. I would love to see that be the case, obviously. And I do think that to the degree that the word gets out from country to country, it certainly does strengthen these movements to know that they're not alone and that this is happening in countries around the world. One of the biggest challenges, though, and this is something that we have to confront, is that those of us in the West who would love to be very supportive of the idea of this kind of change for women's rights can't do so in a way that makes it look as though the West is the driving force. That only undermines these women who are working so hard in their countries for this kind of change. and puts them at greater risk and greater danger. We cannot in any way be seen to be instigating any of it or pushing it from behind. All we can do is try to lift their voices.
I think the most distressing thing about this conversation is I'm left with the view that there really isn't much we can do to help right the situation in Afghanistan, and that it continues to get worse and worse. So I suppose the lessons learned are best used for other situations around the world. And in the last few minutes, what I'd like to do is have each of the panelists tell us what you think the lessons are from Afghanistan for U.S. involvement in other current conflicts such as Ukraine, Syria, Yemen, and Myanmar. And I'm going to start out with Inspector General Sopko. Do you think that we should be creating a special Inspector General for Ukraine?
I personally think we should, because we've had a success, I think, in Iraq with the SIGAR, Special IG for Iraq Reconstruction, and I think, without tooting my horn too much, we have in Afghanistan. It's set up to focus on a lot of money being spent in a country in a war zone. And you need to have support and oversight there immediately. And being in a special IG, you go out of business, but you're at some point, but you mainly are focused on that one country. And I think that's helpful. And there's a lot of similarities between Ukraine and Afghanistan. There's a lot of dissimilarities, and I don't want to say Afghanistan and Ukraine are the same, but we are pouring a tremendous amount of money very quickly into Ukraine. I think we have poured in about $113 billion to the Ukraine in 1 year. And at that pace, I think after 18 months, we will have spent more money in the Ukraine than we did in all of Afghanistan for 20 years. So you gotta focus on it, and the problem of spending too much, too quickly, and too little oversight is something that should be sending red or orange lights blinking somewhere in the Pentagon and in Congress.
I'm actually really surprised to hear that we don't have an Inspector General for Ukraine, given how much money that we're spending there. Let me turn it to Greg Noon. What is the lesson learned in your mind?
I think the lesson is we can't abandon our allies in the field. And if you do, the next time you need allies, you may not have any. And what I'm specifically talking about with respect to Afghanistan are what we owed, the debt that we owed to the interpreters and the fixers and people that stepped up and joined us when we asked people to step up and join us. It doesn't mean blindly, mindlessly continuing failed policy, but you have to make sure that you're taking care of the people that have stepped in and agreed to be on your side.
Shannon French, what's your lesson learned?
Well, this won't shock you coming from an ethicist, Michael, but we need to be consistent in making our actions match our values. And that means don't keep making deals with devils. We don't want to continuously undermine our own policies and our own goals by compromises that compromise us and what we're supposed to stand for. So that would be a core point. I would also just want to echo something that my colleagues have all said in one way or another, and that is this point about focus. I, too, keep coming back to 2003 and the invasion of Iraq and wonder what the storyline would have been with Afghanistan if the invasion in 2003 had not happened. And as I look at that, I think, again, with Ukraine, with all of these other conflicts that we've referenced, if we take our eye off the ball, if we allow our focus to shift, as too often we do, then I think we're going to reap some more bad news.
And Paul Williams, I'm going to give you the last word.
Well, Michael, we have to return to American foreign policy driven by our own strategic interests. What we learned from Afghanistan is that we asked men and women to risk their lives. Thousands died, tens of thousands were injured for things that were not necessarily in our strategic interest. We lost the focus. Sure, rule of law, economic growth, education, all very important in Afghanistan. why was that in America's strategic interest? So when we look at Yemen, Libya, Sudan, Syria, Ukraine, and we start to develop these additional Marshall Plans or deploying American troops, we need to do it only for things that are in America's strategic interest. I'm not sure we know what is in our strategic interest in these countries. We have more clarity in Ukraine, which I think is one reason why there is such an investment of time, energy, weapons, and resources. But until we can have a clear-eyed assessment of why we're putting these human and financial resources on the ground and risking the lives of our soldiers like we did in Afghanistan, we're going to continue to fail and not succeed where we must if we want to be able to provide a world that we dream of and hope for.
All right. Well, it's time to bring our program to a close. And I'd like to thank our experts for being with us today and helping us make sense of the crisis in Afghanistan and the implications for the future. It's pretty bleak, I have to tell you, and I think things are just going to get worse, and it's going to tug at our heartstrings. But this panel of experts doesn't think that there's all that much more the United States can be doing. And in fact, maybe there's less. We shouldn't be pouring in financial aid continuously to a situation where the Taliban controls the purse strings. So, Mr. John Sopko, Dr. Shannon French, Dr. Paul Williams, and Dr. Greg Noon, thank you all for providing your insights about this important topic. I'm Michael Scharf. You've been listening to Talking Foreign Policy.